Hey, this is Buzz with episode number 33 of AirWaves. It's time for another Radio Tales, backed by popular demand. This time I've got one, it's called Phoenix Phollies. 3 stories about radio in the mid-70s in Phoenix, Arizona. That's up next on AirWaves.
Buzz Stone's AirWaves.
Hey, Buzz signing in, episode 33 of AirWaves. It's Radio Tales time again. This time, Phoenix Phollies. 3 stories about radio in Phoenix, Arizona in the mid-70s. The 3 stories, I call them the KRIZ Man, You Did What, and the Palace of the Desert. Story number 1, the KRIZ Man. In the mid-70s, there were 3 AM Top 40 radio stations in Phoenix. They were KRIZ, which was called KRIZ, KRUX, which was called KRUX, and KUPD, which was called KUPD. And there were also, KUPD also had an FM simulcast station, 100,000 watts as a matter of fact. And I think about 1974, another FM Top 40, KBBC FM, signed on, and they were Top 40 for a few years. But KRIZ, KRUX, and KUPD had been Top 40 through most of the 60s and up to this point in the mid-70s, and we're competing against each other pretty heavily. And this story centers around KRIZ and the KRIZ Man. Well, one day, one of my high school buddies, his name was Tom, and I went to Metro Center. Now, Metro Center was it's still there, huge mall in Phoenix, Arizona. At the time, I believe it was built as the largest mall in America, and it was really quite something for its time. And when you entered the main entrance to the mall, you came in on the 2nd floor of the mall. And in front of you was this glass bridge that went over the 1st floor of the mall. And below that bridge was a full-size ice skating rink. So people would come in and stand there on the bridge and look down, watch people ice skating and stuff. And on the other side of that bridge was the food court. And the food court was pretty large, and it was made to look like an international airport. And so you had all these booths, with the different food, and they were named after airlines. So, like, for instance, there was a Lufthansa. They looked like ticket counters at an airport. So they had like Lufthansa, and it was German food, and Aeromexico was Mexican, and American Airlines was hamburgers or something, and so on. They even had the body of a jet airliner cut in half from top to bottom, lengthwise, so you could go in there and sit in the seats and eat your food inside the airliner. So this mall was really something, and it was the place where most people went to gather. Well, my friend Tom and I were there one day, and we're standing there on that bridge watching people ice skate below. And at that time, I was working for KRUX, KRUX, and my friend Tom was working for KUPD, KUPD. Now, we had gone to high school together, and I think in another video I mentioned that we had a radio club at the high school I went to, and several of us went on to have careers in radio. But we were there at the mall, just relaxing, something to do. And in walks another friend of ours who worked at KRIZ, KRIZ. Well, his name was Kurt. And Kurt, in radio, all 3 of us were working part-time. We did weekends and fill-in shifts for the station, so we were just out of high school. And Kurt walks in, and he's dressed as the KRIZ Man. Well, the KRIZ Man was this kind of a superhero type character that KRIZ had dreamed up. And they would send the KRIZ Man out to public places and give away things, money or albums, concert tickets, whatever. Well, Kurt walks in, and he's got the KRIZ Man costume on, And you had to see this costume to believe it. It was like a hot pink bodysuit, covered the head all the way down to the toe. And if I remember correctly, across the chest, it said in like a teal blue KRIZ. And then he had a face mask that was also hot pink. So he comes in, and of course we spot him right away, and he sees us, and he walks over, and so we said, "Kurt, what's going on, man?" He says, "I'm the KRIZ Man today, you know. I got to go in here and give away some stuff, you know." And what he would do, I think at this time, they were walking up to people, and if they had KRIZ written down on something, they were giving them like anywhere from $100 to $1,000. So he says, "Yeah, I'm going to go into the mall here and see if I can get some winners." So I said, "Okay, well, good luck, you know." And he disappears, goes through the food court, and then out of sight on into the heart of the mall. Well, Tom and I are standing there talking, you know, and not too much time goes by. All of a sudden we hear this loud commotion coming from the far side of the food court. So, you know, we turn around, we're looking over there, and eventually we see these two big security guards coming, and they've got Kurt, the KRIZ Man, one on each one of his arms, and they're holding him up in the air and carrying him out of the mall, going past us there on the bridge. And as they've got him lifted up, he's just kicking his feet madly, and as he goes past us, we hear him yell, "But I'm the KRIZ Man!" So they carried him on out the mall, and he was gone. So of course, we saw him later. I mean, you know, they didn't arrest him or anything, but he was not wanted there in the mall. So one of the crazy things that goes on in radio promotions, and a story I love. I wish I tried real hard looking on the internet to see if I could find a picture of the KRIZ Man, but I wasn't able to find any. So that's the KRIZ Man, story number one. Story number two is You Did What? As I mentioned, I worked at KRUX, and one of the reasons that I got a job there was because another high school friend of mine who was in the radio club, his name was Chuck. He was 19 years old, and he was the chief engineer for KRUX. I want to tell you, this guy was and is a genius. When we were in high school, he built a radio studio in his bedroom that we would go there and practice and record tapes, you know, of doing radio shows. And when I say he built a studio, he built it from scratch. I mean, he built the control board, the mixer, from scratch. And this thing was made out of sheet metal. You know, it was back then, mixers were big. It was a big thing. And built all the audio processing, everything. I mean, the guy truly is a genius. And so I was looking, I had been working at another radio station, KRDS, which is coming up, story number 3. But it wasn't top 40 radio, and my dream was to work in top 40. So anyway, Chuck helped get me in the door, and they ended up hiring me to do weekend fill-in shifts, and also to help out with the research department, which, you know, that's usually if you're a part-time guy. They always had you doing, you know, other jobs during the week. So anyway, this one day I just happened to be at the radio station. It was on a weekday when I normally wouldn't be working, but I was there for some reason, probably helping out with a research project. And I'm talking to Chuck, and all of a sudden the general manager walks up, and he says, "Hey Chuck," he says, "I took care of that weed problem out at the tower." Now, we had 2 towers. There may have been 3. My memory's not real clear on this, but there was at least 2, possibly 3 towers that were right out back behind the radio station. Now, during the daytime, KRUX was 5,000 watts, and it was omnidirectional. Had 1 tower. You know, it was equal. The signal went out equally in all directions. But at night, to protect other stations on that same frequency, we had to go directional, which required at least 2 and possibly 3 towers, which would make your signal directional. Now, we were on the west side of Phoenix, and fortunately our signal was directional going east, so even though we reduced power from 5,000 a day to 500 at night, you really couldn't hear the difference in the signal strength, especially with some device that Chuck had built, again from scratch, and he called it the Modu Chucker, which was a modulation device that really made the station loud. But anyway, we're sitting there talking, and like I say, the general manager comes up and says, "Chuck, I took care of that weed problem." And Chuck's like, "What did you do?" And apparently the city of Phoenix, or we were actually in Glendale, a suburb of Phoenix, so I guess it was probably the city of Glendale, had apparently been complaining about the weeds growing up in the field behind the radio station where the towers were. And they were constantly having to get people to go in there and cut the weeds down and mow the field and everything, and I guess it was, probably expensive. So the general manager came up with this great idea that he was going to plow the field up and plow the weeds under. So he tells Chuck, "Hey Chuck, yeah, I got somebody to come and plow the weeds down." And Chuck says, "You did what?" And he immediately turns around and runs out the back door towards the towers. Now here's something that you may or may not know about radio towers. If you're an AM radio station like KRUX was, the tower is your antenna, whereas on an FM station the tower is not the antenna, it's just a structure to hold the antenna, which is a smaller thing called a bay that's up near the top of the tower. But on AM, the tower is the antenna, but what you see above ground is only half of the tower. There's also a wire 360-degree radial pattern that's buried underground of copper wires that are the same length as the tower that you see above ground, but they're in a circular pattern radiating from the center of the tower. That's what gives the station its ground signal. And what you typically hear if you're within what they call the city grade signal of a station. Well, Chuck knew when he heard that they had plowed the field under what had happened. And he disappears, runs out the door, and he comes back after, I don't know, about half hour or so, and he is just beat red in the face. And this is Phoenix, Arizona, and I can't remember what time of year it was, but it's hot most of the year there. And he was red not because so much he was hot, but what he had discovered. When they plowed the field, they had cut through all those wires. And like I say, there were at least 2 towers there. And so they had cut through the ground radials of 2 of the towers. And so what Chuck had to do was go out there with a soldering iron and dig up all those places where they had cut the wires and solder them back together in the hot sun of Phoenix, Arizona. So another crazy story, but something that actually happened at KRUX in Phoenix. And finally, story number 3, and this one involves me again. This was actually my first professional radio job, and it was for a station KRDS. Now, KRDS was licensed to Tolleson, Arizona, which again was western suburbs of Phoenix. It was really was an pretty much undeveloped area. It was a lot of farm land out there. And Arizona has a lot of irrigation ditches, Phoenix does, and to irrigate the crops. They grow a lot of produce. And but anyway, I was still a senior in high school, and I had gotten my FCC 3rd class radio telephone operator's license with broadcast endorsement. And you needed that license really if you were going to be on the air unattended, because you had to have the broadcast endorsement in order to make adjustments to the transmitter and take transmitter readings. And KRDS was an AM station on 1190, and during the daytime they were talk radio, not like the talk radio that we have today so much. It was basically, they had 2 guys. They had a guy from 6 in the morning till noon, and then another guy from noon to 6. And they would talk about local stuff. mostly, and not necessarily political talk like you hear today. It could be anything. They had the guy in the morning, I think he was more of a straight down the road guy. The guy in the afternoon was actually an Englishman. His name was Reggie, and the women loved him. And he called everybody Love, yes, Love. And so he seemed to talk about things that women enjoyed talking about, whereas the guy in the morning was probably more of a male directed audience. But then, what's odd about this station is, at 6 p.m., they switched format and went to Spanish speaking format. They played music. And it was basically pop music, but in Spanish. And they had 2 disc jockeys on, and both of these guys were here with green cards, but they weren't U.S. citizens. And you could not have an FCC license unless you were a U.S. citizen. So they needed somebody to basically what we call babysit them, and that's what they hired me to do. But they also hired me to do. We were a station that carried the Albuquerque Dukes, which was a AAA baseball team, and why we were carrying that in Phoenix, I have no idea. But anytime we ran one of the Dukes baseball games, I ran the board and played all the local commercials and everything. But so between that and babysitting the 2 Mexican DJs at night, I was pretty much working full time. And so anyway, I would come in, and from 6 to midnight, I had to sit with these guys, and basically I, every 3 hours I had to go back and check the transmitter and put down readings and everything, and if there were any technical issues, they needed help with, I would help them. And then at midnight, there was a woman came in, and she continued the Spanish programming from midnight to 6 a.m., but she was an American, and but she spoke fluent Spanish. Well, it wasn't too long. Well, I'd been there at least several months. I think I ended up working there around a year. There was some point where she developed some kind of a medical issue, and they needed somebody to fill in for her, and I was it. Now, I'd had 1 year of Spanish in high school, so I was by no means fluent, but we were playing music, and so I could read the titles, on the records. And I mentioned the Palace of the Desert was his 3rd story. Well, KRDS, when they were doing their Spanish programming, that's what they called it, the Palace of the Desert. But, of course, we had to say it in Spanish, so it was KRDS, that's KRDS, El Palacio de Cierta. KRDS, the Palace of the Desert. And what was funny was, I would give the time in Spanish and the ID and read this, play the music and the titles. And people would call in and request songs, and of course they were doing it in Spanish, and I wasn't fluent enough to understand a lot of times what they were saying, so I would always say, no comprende español, and then they would say in English, what? You don't speak Spanish? So anyway, that went on for quite a while, and I got bored. So I started bringing in a box of my 45s, which were the top 40 hits, and I thought, there's nobody listening to this station at night anyway. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, I started playing top 40 music, and I would play it till 5 o'clock in the morning. And because I figured, after 5, maybe somebody might hear it. So I might get in trouble. And so one night, I get this call, and it's from the overnight DJ at KRIZ, KRIZ. And he says, hey man, what are you doing playing top 40 music? And I said, well, just because I want to. And like I said, we were 1190 on the dial, and KRIZ was 1230. So we were very close together. He says, listeners are getting us confused. They're calling in requesting songs we don't play, and they say that we heard it on the radio, and I finally figured out it's because you're playing it, I said, so I basically told him, well, too bad, get over it. Well, apparently he got in contact with the central office, which was in Metro Center, the mall that I was telling you about in the first story. And so word got to the general manager that we weren't continuing our Spanish programming all through the night. And this memo comes from on high down to our studio out in the desert, which basically it was just a shack. You know, they had this nice penthouse suite at the mall, but we're out in a shack. And so they were very diplomatic about it, though. He just says, it has come to my attention that we are not continuing our Spanish programming all through the night. Please do so. And it's signed, you know, by the general manager. His name's George. So, you know, that was a bummer for me, you know. So I'd say I'd been there close to a year now. And I'm thinking, I want to work in top 40 radio. I just, you know, this is not for me. Well, it just so happened that I was still working the 6 to midnight babysitting job, and then midnight to 6 doing air shifts. So I was working 12-hour shifts, and I had done it at this point for 13 days in a row, and I was like a dead man walking. Well, that morning when I was driving home, and it was a good drive, it was 20 some miles from the studio to my house, I fell asleep at some point. Fortunately, the area where I fell asleep was, and it was very early in the morning, was kind of a desolate area, you know, and if you've ever been in Arizona, you'll know there's usually along the roads, there's not like an emergency lane or anything. You're on the road, or else you're in gravel or desert. And I fell asleep at the wheel, and I wake up, and my car is off the road. I'm still driving forward, and there's an irrigation canal off to the right of the road. I'm between the road and an irrigation canal, heading towards the canal when I wake up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, and I really have no idea where I am, or how I got there, or how long I'd been asleep. It was a long straight road, so, you know, I could have been driving fairly straight for who knows how long, but eventually I figured out where I was and went on home and, you know, went to bed. And I woke up, I think it was around noon, and I said to myself, I said, you know, this job's not worth dying over. So I decided I'm going to quit. So, you know, get up, get dressed, get in the car, drive to Metro Center, the mall, and go to the corporate office there in a penthouse suite on top of Metro Center. And I get there, and the receptionist is there, and of course she knows me, and I said, is George in? And she says, yeah, you want to talk to him? I said, yeah, I'd like to talk to him. She says, okay. So she rings back and says, George, Buzz is here, wants to see you about something. He says, oh, send him back, you know. And he was a really nice guy. He was a radio veteran, been in radio a long time. And back then, like I told you, you had to have an FCC license to be on the air. And on the back of that license, they had lines for signatures of the general managers of the stations you worked at. And when you worked at a station, when you left, you were supposed to get the general manager to sign that and say that whether you had done a satisfactory job or not. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I'm going to quit here really with no notice, and I don't want to get a bad reference on the back of my license. So I had my license with me, and I go in there, and we talked for a little bit. And I said, you know, while I'm here, I just wonder if I could get you to sign the back of my license. He says, yeah, sure, you know. So I hand it to him, and he signs it, and I said, okay, well, thank you, I appreciate it, you know. And he says, okay, and I turn around and walk out. Well, as I walk out and I walk past the receptionist, I said, oh, by the way, I quit. And about a week later, I had to go back to get my final paycheck, and so I had to go back to the office there at the mall, and the receptionist has my check. Says, I'm here to get my check. She goes, oh, okay. She says, and she starts kind of chuckling. She says, you know, when you came in here last week, after you left, George calls back out front here, and he says, why did Buzz want me to sign his license? She goes, oh, he quit. So that's how he found out, and you know, I felt kind of bad about it, but on the other hand, I felt like you know, they were kind of taking advantage of me, you know, young guy, first job, and just, you know, working the heck out of me. And so anyway, in the end, it all paid off. It wasn't too much longer after that I got the job at KRUX, thanks to my friend Chuck. So anyway, 3 more radio tales from my storied radio career of over 20 years. That was the Phoenix Phollies, and I'm sure I'll have more stories coming up in the future. I've got one in mind that's just hilarious. So next time I do one, I'll tell that one for sure. But this is Buzz, episode 33 of AirWaves. Hope that you'll subscribe, like, and share the video, and I'll see you down the dial.